There's a reason psalms are whispered at deathbeds, carved into headstones, and repeated when fear crawls too close to the skin. They're not just verses, they're architecture, carefully chosen syllables designed to hold shape in a crumbling world. Most people think of them as songs of comfort, prayers of praise, cries for divine attention from hearts too broken to stand. But that's not the whole truth, because there were other psalms, forgotten ones, deliberately erased, not for lack of poetry or holiness, but because they were too alive. Long before the Bible became the Bible, before canon was law and apocrypha was heresy, the Book of Psalms was more than a hymn book. It was a collection of invocations. Some called them sacred spells. Others said they were a way to speak directly into the ear of God, or something older that God once knew. And not every verse was meant to praise. Some psalms pleaded, some cursed, some commanded, and those were the ones they buried. In 1947, when a Bedouin shepherd stumbled upon a series of ancient scrolls near Qumran, now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a brief moment of panic behind closed doors. Because among the fragments and familiar verses were songs no modern eye had seen. Verses not preserved in church vaults or whispered in secret by monks, but raw, thunderous words that seemed to do something when read aloud. One psalm spoke of a mountain that bleeds. Another described a voice that shatters water. But it wasn't just their content that disturbed scholars. It was the effect they had on people who translated them. Nightmares, seizures, a strange ringing in the ears that couldn't be measured by medical instruments. One translator vanished entirely, his final note reading only, "I didn't believe it until it replied," so they were hidden again, locked away in research archives, mislabeled or made inaccessible. And slowly, the public forgot. Even those who had heard whispers assumed they were just poetic rants, ancient hallucinations scribbled in exile. But scrolls have a way of surviving the fire, and some psalms were written in such a way that even if you remove the paper, the song survives. In dreams, in echoes, in that strange moment when you wake at 3:33 a.m. and feel the need to recite something, but you don't know what or why. This is not about religion. It's about memory, about texts older than the churches that buried them. Words that were once believed to shape the world. Words some now claim were never meant to be read by us at all. Welcome to Tales from the Forbidden Library, where the syllables no longer sanctified still sing beneath the silence. They were discovered where no scripture should have survived, deep within the limestone caves of the Judean desert, carved not on scrolls, but directly into the walls themselves. No ink, no parchment, just scorched stone, etched with characters that flared like coal under torchlight and seemed to shimmer in the corner of one's vision. Unlike the other Dead Sea Scrolls, these were not found in jars or protected by linen wrappings. They were burned into the cave, as if the act of writing had involved not a hand, but a flame. The scholars who first saw them didn't recognize the script. It bore resemblance to Paleo-Hebrew, but the arrangement was off, angular, spiral-like, rhythmic, almost as if it was meant to be sung, not read. And when they began to transliterate the first few lines, a strange thing happened. The cave grew hotter. Instruments recorded a rise in ambient temperature by 3 degrees. Dust began to rise from the ground, swirling unnaturally. One of the translators collapsed, choking, claiming the letters were speaking to each other. The inscription was later decoded and identified as a psalm, but unlike any in the known canon. It began not with praise, but proclamation. O flame that was before light, burn the mouths of liars and the shadows they hide in. Let the stone remember your first roar, and let the desert tremble beneath your oldest name. It was a psalm of judgment, not divine mercy, not thanksgiving, but command. Each stanza read like a spell meant to awaken something buried, not in the earth, but in time itself. Some lines referenced fire with sentience, stone with memory, and wind that carries names not yet spoken. But the most unsettling line came near the end. To speak this psalm aloud is to return the world to its unfinished shape. The team sealed the cave. Later, one researcher privately admitted he had tried reading the entire psalm aloud in a secure room. He said nothing happened at first, but later that night, he noticed his voice echoing strangely, even in his own head. His reflection in the mirror would sometimes mouth different words than he was speaking. Eventually, he was found disoriented in a salt flat, muttering a language no one could identify, eyes blackened, not from bruising, but from within. The official record labeled the cave as unstable, closed to further study. But in the years since, similar inscriptions have turned up in strange places. An abandoned monastery in Armenia, a collapsed shrine in Ethiopia, even the charred floorboards of a burned-down chapel in southern Italy. Each time, the symbols match, and each time, something happens to the person who tries to translate them. There is now an unofficial name for this fragment, the Psalm of Returning Flame. Some believe it was part of an earlier Book of Psalms, a version reserved not for public worship, but for the priests who stood closest to the holy fire. Others believe it wasn't Hebrew at all, but a mimicry of sacred text, a psalm not to God, but to something older and far less forgiving either way. It was meant to be erased. And like all things erased, it found its way back. In the ruins near Qumran, not far from where the Dead Sea Scrolls were first unearthed, a lesser-known discovery was made and then swiftly buried beneath layers of academic silence. A series of fragmented hymns written in brittle ink on goat parchment, preserved in a ceramic container sealed with red wax. The language was Aramaic, but warped. Some words didn't exist in any dialect, ancient or modern. The fragments referred repeatedly to a figure known only as the mouth without will. According to the hymns, he was not a priest, nor a scribe, nor even a prophet in the traditional sense. He was a vessel, an orphan raised in a remote sect that believed divine utterance could possess the human throat. He didn't speak in his own voice. He sang in dreams. When he awoke, there were verses on the walls written in salt, in charcoal, in his own blood. And those verses, the hymns say, controlled the weather. One fragment reads, "He sang the sky open, he sang the drought into mercy, he sang the lion into sleep, but he never sang for himself." Some scholars who reviewed the fragments insisted they were merely metaphorical, poetic hallucinations of an unstable mystic. But others, particularly those familiar with Babylonian and pre-Abrahamic rituals, saw something different, a technique, a pattern, a linguistic structure designed not to praise, but to command. The most intact hymn was only 17 lines long. It was translated once. Then, never again. Why? Because the graduate student who completed the translation reported sudden episodes of speaking in a voice she didn't recognize. Her vocal cords were damaged, not from yelling, but from vibration, as if something had moved through her. She claimed tearfully that while reading the hymn aloud in private, she had felt a presence enter the room, not beside her, behind her eyes. Within days, she disappeared, her notes were confiscated, and the university issued a quiet retraction of the publication, citing incomplete authentication. But a copy of the hymn survived on a hidden server, downloaded by an anonymous group of researchers who began a project called the Psalm Wave Index, a digital effort to identify forbidden acoustic patterns hidden in ancient scripture. Their findings? When sung at a specific frequency, the hymn causes minor tremors in glass, visible plant movement, and, in one case, temporary loss of facial recognition in listeners. The audio file was eventually deleted after one member claimed his mother's voice had been replaced with the hymn melody in real life. What disturbs those who've studied the fragment isn't just what it does, but what it promises. One line, in particular, has caused scholars to quietly resign from the project altogether. When the last name is sung, the tongue will burn, and God will speak through ash again. Was this a metaphor for death, or a prophecy of return? Perhaps the hymn was never meant to be sung by the devout. Perhaps it was written as a test, to see who would dare utter what even angels refuse to echo. In any case, the hymn has not been fully recovered. But those who've heard even part of it say they still hear it, humming in quiet places, echoing in silence, waiting for someone to finish the verse. Ashkelon, one of the 5 ancient cities of the Philistines, was a place of blood and salt. Its temples were built with stone dragged from coastal cliffs, and its libraries, though destroyed and rebuilt many times, were said to contain texts older than the Torah, older than Babylon, older even than Egypt's Book of the Dead. Among the rubble of one of its collapsed crypts, sometime in the 1800s, a British explorer named Reuben Ash found something that would later become known as the Book of Ashkelon. It wasn't a book in the traditional sense, more like a bundle of psalms, each inscribed on square stone tablets about the size of a hand, wrapped in black linen and sealed with a brittle resin that cracked like bone when disturbed. The language was Hebrew, but not quite. The psalms bore all the hallmarks of sacred text: invocation of divine names, poetic structure, even antiphonal responses meant to be echoed by a congregation. But these weren't songs of praise. These were formulas. Each psalm was paired with an instruction. Some began with, to be recited before walking into a storm. Others stated, to be spoken beside the bed of a fading man. But most chilling were the ones marked, to bring the unseen forward. One such psalm read, speak thrice in breathless tone, then strike the stone with flame, let the breath of old dust rise, and the silence give you its name. These weren't metaphorical rites, they were precise, technical. It became quickly evident to Ash and the small team of researchers who reviewed the tablets that the Psalms had once been used in ritual settings, not for worship, but for interaction. With what? They couldn't agree. Some said angels, others shadows. A few believed the texts were early demonological instructions, ways of compelling hidden intelligences to appear without invoking traditional names of God. The Ashkelon Psalms were never published, not officially. But word of them spread. In 1902, a Vatican archivist reportedly traveled to the British Museum under false credentials to examine the fragments. Days later, 2 of the most dangerous tablets vanished from the private collection. The museum claimed they had been miscatalogued, but the remaining ones were quietly removed from public viewing, locked in cold storage under security concern. One of the surviving psalms, according to leaked transcriptions, was titled simply, Psalm of the Second Voice. It included a line that has troubled biblical scholars ever since. And if your prayer is heard, pray again. For the first who hears is not the last to listen. What did the ancients of Ashkelon know? That prayer was not only transmission, but invitation? That to speak into the silence is to offer yourself to whoever listens first? Even more troubling was the discovery of marginal notes on the linen wrappings, notes written centuries later in medieval Latin. One, translated, read, "Seal this in salt. These are not songs. These are doors." To this day, the Book of Ashkelon remains unverified by mainstream theology. But off the record, several religious institutions acknowledge its existence. They simply disagree on whether it was divine knowledge or heretical instruction too dangerous to repeat. And so it was buried again, but not destroyed, because as one final cracked psalm tablet reads, no flame erases the syllable once it's been sung. There's a legend whispered among certain monastic circles, those whose vows of silence are not only spiritual, but protective. A legend of a psalm not included in any scroll, tablet, or codex, because it was never written with hands. It was transmitted once, sung, and the earth reacted. They call it the Psalm of the End-Bearer, the song without return. Its melody is said to twist the shape of time, melt causality, and unmake the listener. Not through violence, not through flame or plague, but through silence so deep, it erases the moment before sound was born. The first trace of this psalm appeared in the margins of a forbidden hymnal found in a cathedral outside Avignon, France, one that had been sealed since the 14th century. The cathedral itself was intact, but the altar had melted. Not burned, melted, as if exposed to heat from inside the stone. Carved into the floor were musical notations, the Nume symbols of ancient Gregorian chant, but they trailed off into jagged strokes, as if the singer had been interrupted mid-transmission by something final. A Latin inscription near the altar read, "Verba quae clausura sunt," words that are endings. Over the centuries, fragments of this psalm's existence have surfaced in unsettling places. A folk song in rural Armenia that children refused to sing past the third verse. A shepherd's melody from the Atlas Mountains that made birds fall from the sky. Even a lullaby once whispered by a girl in Lithuania during sleep, though she claimed she had never heard it before. Those who have attempted to reconstruct the melody never finish. Instruments snap, recordings glitch. One linguist's tongue reportedly swelled and turned black after attempting to hum it phonetically. When asked what happened, she simply wrote, "The melody knew I wasn't ready." What is it about this psalm that frightens even the devout? Some believe it was a final gift to humanity, a way to end suffering by undoing creation, a mercy key hidden in sound. Others believe it's not meant for us at all, but for something that waits beyond the edge of understanding, listening for the sequence of notes that will open the gate. But the most disturbing theory is this, that the psalm doesn't just end the world, it ends you, not physically, but metaphysically, cutting the thread of identity that connects memory, soul, and time. After the psalm is heard, they say, "You may still be alive, but you will no longer have been." There is one last line, translated from a 17th century monastery text, believed to be a paraphrase of the original. "Let the final voice be not a cry, but a note, so perfect it forgets itself." To this day, no one has fully sung the Psalm of the End-Bearer aloud. Or if they have, we no longer remember them, and perhaps that's the point. We've been taught that Scripture is sanctuary, that the sacred word offers comfort, order, and a hand to hold when the world trembles. And for the most part it does. But comfort is only one function of the sacred. The other is confrontation, revelation, unearthing what should have stayed buried. The Psalms we know, the ones recited in churches and temples across the world, were carefully chosen for their resonance, rhythm, and reverence, but they were also filtered, curated, selected from a wider, stranger ocean of spiritual language. And what was left behind wasn't forgotten because it lacked beauty. It was silenced because it carried power, not metaphorical power, but actual effect. Songs that changed rooms, verses that made things move. These weren't psalms for the faithful. They were psalms for the fearless. What happens when you give ordinary people words that bend the edge of time? When syllables meant to be sung only in visions are whispered by untrained throats? History tells us exactly what happens. Madness, disappearance, phenomena without explanation, and institutions scrambling to seal what should never have been found. But some words don't stay buried. They echo, and in rare cases they seek the listener. Through dreams, through forgotten melodies hummed by children, through pages that should not exist in libraries that never listed them. The truth is, not all holy language was meant to heal. Some verses were meant to bind, others to summon, and a few, a precious, terrifying few, were meant to test us, to see if we would dare lift our voice and sing them, knowing full well that the echo might not come from our world. So the next time you hear a chant you don't recognize, a verse that stirs something ancient in your bones, remember this: some psalms didn't disappear. They're waiting for the right mouth, for the right moment, for the one who can't help but sing